Okay. All right, are we all here? Okay, all right. Thank you everybody for coming to this, I guess the first real sessions to start off ICCB. My name is Matt Tschumi. I'm a marine scientist from a university in Saudi Arabia, and I'm the moderator today. So we have our 5-minute talks, and the game plan is that each speaker will go through their 5-minute talk, and then we will hold questions until after everyone has finished. The conference organizers have allotted, I believe, 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session, so we'll wait until then. I'll introduce our speakers, they'll come up, give their presentations, and we'll row through just like that. And so to keep us on time, I'll introduce our first speaker is Mattias Tschumi from Lund University. Welcome up.
Thank you. Is there a pointer? Uh-oh, time is running. Okay, thank you. What an honor to be the first presenter in the first session. So I'm going to present to you quickly some results of an experiment that we did last year, where we looked at the contribution of different predators to ecosystem services and disservices in agricultural landscapes. So the questions that we were addressing here is how does the local habitat and landscape composition affect the functional composition of predator communities? How does this translate into ecosystem services and disservices, which would be damage to agricultural, either direct or indirect? And what is the contribution of birds, rodents, and invertebrates? And although not really being purely conservation focused, we still like the basic idea was to identify if there is win-wins for conservation of habitats and predator species and agricultural production. So we did an experiment, selected 8 landscapes in a landscape complexity gradient in southern Sweden. Within each landscape, we then choose 2 cereal fields, whereas one was located next to a semi-natural grassland that we know is important for many species, and the other one was not bordering a semi-natural grassland, just bordering crops. And within each field, we established a predation experiment in a factorial exclusion design, like excluding vertebrates and invertebrates with cages and trays, excluding vertebrates only, excluding invertebrates only, and allowing access to both. And in addition, we had a wildlife camera that was monitoring the vertebrates to see the identity of the vertebrate predators. And then in these trays, we sequentially provided different resources to predators. On one hand, animal prey, on the other hand, plant seeds. And for both categories, we included a pest, potential pest animal, and a potential pest plant, which is wheat seeds, and a beneficial crop seeds and a beneficial invertebrate. And these items were predated, and so here you can see the results of the contribution of the different predators. So again, we have these different exclusions. So this is the negative control, that should be around 0. The contribution of invertebrates here, the contribution of vertebrates, and the contribution of both. And here for crop seeds, wheat seeds, beneficial prey, and pest prey. And what you can see is that the vertebrates are the strongly dominant predators of seeds, both seeds, whereas vertebrates and invertebrates were comparable predators of animal resources. But what is also striking is that there is a similar contribution of services and disservices in both categories. So these look pretty similar, right? If you look more closely at the the vertebrate predators, we could see that the rodents were strongly dominant predators compared to birds. 90% were rodents. And if you look at the landscape, we were surprised to not find any clear effect of local habitat or landscape complexity on the predation of all resources. So in conclusion, we could see that birds, small mammals, and invertebrates all contribute to ecosystem services, but they also contribute to disservices. The predation of vertebrates was strongly dominated by small rodents, whereas birds only contributed 10% in this particular system. And we didn't find any clear effect of local habitat or landscape context on this predation. So in conclusion, it shouldn't sound too negative, but I think we should be aware of for conservation projects or land use decisions such as agroenvironment schemes that enhancing ecosystem services to predator conservation may indeed also come at the cost of a simultaneous increase in some disservices. Thank you.
Alrighty. Our next speaker is Bengt Gunnar Jonsson from Mid-Sweden University. And your presentation is... There you go. Let's get it up there.
Well, thank you. We remain in Sweden for another talk. So, this is an analysis of effects of policy. We all know that forestry threatens biodiversity, and it's so obvious that we also have legislation and laws and policies and certification schemes are trying to address this conflict. And one critical factor for the biodiversity in many forests is the amount of dead wood. It's a key factor, and it's also in the core of the conflict between biodiversity and human use of the forest. In Northern Europe, about 25% of all forest species are what we call saproxylic species, meaning that they are dependent on dead trees for some part of their life cycle. And this translates into about 6,000 to 7,000 forest species in Northern Europe. And obviously we are competing with these species as humans because we use the forest for timber and paper and so on. And to some extent we could perhaps identify ourselves as also saproxylic species depending on the dead trees. Sweden is composed about 60% of forests, and we have a strong forest policy implemented since the early 1990s, which emphasizes that production and forest production and environmental aspects should have equal weight in the forest policy. And this includes also clear targets around the management of the deadwood resource. What we've done in this study is that we use data from the National Forest Inventory from the early 1990s to 2012. The data is composed of 30,000 plots across all of Sweden, which are analyzed in a 5-year cycle. So it's a pretty good and solid data. In our study, we had 3 questions. What has happened during this time period with the new policy implemented? Why have we failed? Because we have failed. A spoiler here in the beginning. And finally, what can be done? And I will provide 3 answers to each of these 3 questions. What has happened? Not much. On the national level, we have increased the amount of dead wood from about 6 cubic meters to 8 cubic meters per hectare. In a truly natural forest in this region of the world, we should have around 100 cubic meters of dead wood. So there's a big difference. What has happened, though, related to the actual small increase we have seen, is storm events. A good example is the big storm in December 2005, when a full annual harvest was felled during a single storm event. And although a lot was salvage logged, we see clear effects in the data from this storm event. And the third answer on what has happened is that even in the northernmost part of Sweden, we've seen a decrease in the amount of deadwood during this time period. The second question, why we have failed? Well, one thing is that the mortality in managed forest are biologically very small. This is the whole purpose of management, to reduce the mortality in the living tree layer. Secondly, we still have a negative attitude among many forest managers towards deadwood. You see this a waste and a potential source for pest insects. And thirdly, the certification schemes are actually too weak. Even if fully implemented over a full rotation time, we would only have around 10 to 12 cubic meters per hectare. So what can be done? Well, one thing that we still need to work on is a target protection of remaining high natural value forests with existing amounts of deadwood. And secondly, we also need active restoration in protected areas. Currently, we only have, as an effect of past forest management, around 25 cubic meters in our protected forests. And finally, we clearly need to strengthen the certification and policy guidelines to move into a better situation. So thank you very much for listening. And as I now have 30 seconds left, perhaps I would also like to advertise the European Congress of Conservation Biology next year, 2018, in Finland, in Jyväskylä. And please check the home site for more information. Thank you.
All right, and next up we have Fredrik from Universiteit Antwerpen. Laser pointer and then just change it.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. From Scandinavia, we go to the tropical rainforest. I'm going to talk about two major reasons for the conservation: carbon storage and biodiversity. Carbon storage should be conserved because of their importance in the battle against climate change, and biodiversity is important for ecosystem functioning. From the point of view of conservation, it would be most efficient to conserve them both at the same time. But can we? Can we safely say that conservation programs such as RED Plus that are focused on carbon also deliver co-benefits for biodiversity? Well, this depends on the relationship between carbon storage and biodiversity. What we know from the literature is limited to a few taxonomic groups. Most research has been done on trees. I only found one paper on mammals and birds. Also, most often the relationship has been quantified based on species richness. What we found is that if we look at more than one taxonomic group, the positive relationships found for trees are not actually that predominant. And we looked at this in our study area in the center of the Congo Basin. We've installed forest plots in old growth forest and regrowth forest, where we measured carbon storage and the diversity of these 10 taxonomic groups, ranging from trees over fungi to invertebrates and vertebrates. So these are the polynomial relationships between carbon storage and diversity. On the left we have the on the left you have the regrowth forest, on the right the old growth forest, which have the highest carbon. So for trees we found, as expected, an increase in diversity with increasing carbon storage. The same was true for leaf lichens. But all other taxa showed different patterns. Most often they were random, but for slime mold it was even decreasing. So for conservation this does not look too bad. There was only 1 out of 10 decreasing. However, when we look at differences in community composition, we found that differences between plots in terms of species composition are higher when the difference is in carbon stock is higher between those plots. And this was significant for all the taxa in a full line. Moreover, we looked at specialization. So we tried to classify species in specialists for regrowth forests, so low carbon forests, and old growth forests, so the high carbon forests. And we found specialists to both forest types in nearly all taxonomic groups. Most species were even too rare to classify, so this level of specialization might even be underestimated. For conservation and in terms of co-benefits, This means that we've only found positive correlations for trees and leaf lichens. All other taxonomic groups showed different patterns. But what's more important is that there were differences in community composition, which indicates that there is a spatial species turnover over the carbon gradient. And we found species specialized even to low carbon habitats. This means that, of course, conservation should start from conserving old growth forest, primary forest, but also include low carbon forests as they have an important added value for biodiversity. Lastly, I think that biodiversity is multidimensional and a multi-trophic concept, so we shouldn't only look at trees and species richness, but include many taxonomic groups and, like we did here, look at different aspects of their diversity. So these are my collaborators, and I'll be happy to take questions during the break. Thank you.
Alrighty. So next up is Rachel Kappler from Bowling Green State University. And your presentation is right here, and this is your laser pointer.
Okay. Good morning. I'm here to go over our population viability analysis of green ash trees with emerald ash borer scenarios. Green ash trees range along the eastern half of the US and Canada, and populations have been reduced from the invasive emerald ash borer beetle, which is originally from Asia and has likely transferred via Detroit, Michigan in ash wood shipping crates. On the map here you can see there are a bunch of red dots, and that is indicating where the beetle has been detected as of July this year. And the outlying areas have been put under quarantine protocol in the United States and in Canada. The emerald ash borer is a beetle that attacks all species of ash, and the beetles lay eggs on the bark and hatch larvae which eat the nutrient transferring area underneath the bark, thus killing the tree. The trees can be dying from an infestation as small as 3 centimeters diameter at breast height. The focal population of this model is located in the 1,500 hectare Oak Openings Preserve near Toledo, Ohio. Green ash was once the dominant stream floodplain tree, and it had a massive die-off between 2005 to 2008. This changed the composition of the floodplain forest, and the U.S. Forest Service has been looking into the changes pre and post EAB infestation. Some adult trees of ash are still alive in this population and in this preserve, and the beetle numbers have been decreasing, so we are past peak mortality for ash trees now. The U.S. Forest Service is assessing if these adult trees are highly resistant to emerald ash borer, and with the U.S. Forest Service, we've been collecting data on these individual adult trees for the last 12 years, and the younger cohort for the last 3 years. With this, we do a population viability analysis that quantifies the changes in population persistence over time. Using the Ramus Metapop software, we input the inputs consist of known population parameters needed for each of the tree size classes, which is represented by the circles. And then we also need the number of individuals, the growth probabilities, the survival probabilities, and the annual fecundity for each of these stage classes. Settings for these models allow for year-to-year variability and vital rates to occur, and these models predict persistence for the next 50 years, but they do not include catastrophes, habitat restrictions, or competitive interactions that may occur in that time. When looking at the models on this graph here, we have models containing data that were data from peak mortality were predicted to go to extinct within the first 10 years. And then historic models were done, and the parameters with that were from the literature. These ones end up doing quite well, even after the population has declined. But our current models parameters are derived from monitoring ash after the peak ash population decline. And these predict that ash populations will gradually decline over the next 50 years. Increment changes in seedling survival was done in a variety of models in order to examine the model sensitivity, which showed that the model was most sensitive to changes in the survival of the young trees, and not from other parameters, for example, fecundity. So in this table, we see in the middle, each of the models on the row had a change in their parameter, and only one parameter for each of these models was changed, and that was seedling survival. And over on this side, we see that for each of the models, each of the rows, only fecundity was changed in this model. So our current model shows that we have 22 years as a mean time till extinction for this population. And that expectation doesn't change at all when we change fecundity. But when we're looking at variations in the survival of the next cohort seedlings, we have a wide variation of mean time till extinction. So it seems very important for us to take a look at preserving the natural population of the next cohort in this population. So currently, release of biocontrols are being used for management in natural populations, and there's also research with the U.S. Forest Service in finding ash trees resistant or more resistant to emerald ash borer for future replantings. Our work here shows that management should focus on younger trees and natural areas that have already been past the peak infestation of the beetle. Thank you.
All right. And our next speaker up is Sam Veloz from Point Blue Conservation Science.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be talking about a project that Point Blue is partnering with the Nature Conservancy, ESA, and a number of state and federal agencies to provide guidance for implementing coastal natural infrastructure across the coast in California. There's been a lot of work done in California about vulnerabilities to sea level rise. In particular, we know that our highest population coastlines are very vulnerable to even moderate levels of sea level rise. But if you've been reading the news, you probably know that the government in California is not really debating whether climate change exists or what, but really more focused on, well, what are we going to do about it, and how could we potentially reduce the causes of climate change in the first place. Well, what are we going to do about it? And this picture really reflects what people in California have done to protect themselves from storms and coastal flooding in the past. 10% of California's coastline is armored in ways such as this. 30% of Southern California's coastline. So this was really the dominant form of adaptation that people in California have been implementing. The problem is we know that this type of practice has really negative effects for adjacent coastal ecosystems. So the state of California is really interested in both state and local governments and other agencies looking at nature-based options. So these are options that take into account natural processes that continue to provide those protective services, but also provide for habitat for wildlife and plant populations, and at the same time enable these ecosystems to regenerate and to adapt themselves to changing environmental conditions. The problem is that the people who implement this type of infrastructure really have a familiarity gap. They don't know what natural infrastructure is necessarily. They don't know what nature-based solutions are. They're very familiar with those hardened types. And a study by a policy lab out of Stanford found that some of the biggest barriers are having no technical standards for natural infrastructure. Implementing natural infrastructure requires cross-jurisdictional coordination that doesn't exist. There's not a lot of funding for collecting the data to know whether these types of approaches would work. And the public itself is not familiar, and so because of that, politicians don't feel like they have the political support to really take a risk and try these approaches. So these quotes kind of emphasize that point where, again, we don't know what the technical standards are for these approaches. These politicians are sensitive, are nervous to take a risk on an approach where we don't have a lot of evidence to show that it will actually work. So the state funded our team to form, we first formed a technical advisory committee that included policymakers, decision makers from across the state, as well as scientists, ecologists, engineers, to see if we could come up with some guidance. And the first step was defining what we even mean by this term natural infrastructure, which I won't bore you with, but it really, to emphasize the point that it included the objectives of all the participants in that process. And so we came together and came to an agreement on what we were talking about in the first place. The second part was we looked and said, well, who is actually implementing this kind of work across the state? Do we have examples that we can learn from? And so we've created a set of case studies, and we're going to make those available that will help people as they try to start implementing these approaches. Third, the engineers on our team are starting to come up with that technical guidance that was called out as being missing. What are the standards that you need to do if you're going to try to implement some of these approaches? What is the environmental setting where some of these approaches will work? And last, we're trying to build in 2 counties where we have a lot of existing fine-scale data. We're creating a tool that will rank the suitability of these different approaches for each section of coastline. And the goal isn't to say this is the best approach for any one spot, but rather it's a screening tool where you can narrow down your approaches to what's more or less suitable for a given approach, and that'll allow local decision makers to really dive in and investigate what approach might make more sense for them. And I want to end with just saying, you know, this, I think this process that we've engaged in, the model that we're using, is it's going to be an iterative one, and as we learn about what works and what doesn't work. But most importantly, it's interdisciplinary, and we've all been working together on this from the start. And so I think that's the way we're really going to get to these healthy coastal systems that protect both our communities and our ecosystems. And that's all I have. Thanks.
All right, and next up we have Moreno from Cicero. I never know if I say that right. Awesome. There you go. And then that's the laser pointer button.
All right, morning everybody. Thanks very much. Oops. It's not showing up. Cool. Yeah, my name is Moreno Dimarco. I'm presenting work that I've done at the University of Queensland about the relationship between biodiversity and carbon, which actually is probably a good follow-up from the talk that Frederick gave earlier before. So we all know that conserving biodiversity and conserving carbon are both key objectives of multilateral environmental agreements. And so it's important to understand whether there are potential synergies in the conservation of these very two important ecosystem properties. And so basically whether we can use carbon conservation schemes, for example, the REDD+, to conserve biodiversity. So if we look at the literature, we found that in many cases there are examples of a positive relationship, meaning that areas with a higher biodiversity, area with a higher carbon density are also areas with a higher biodiversity content. And this is obviously a good situation for conservation. It means that we can apply carbon conservation schemes to protect biodiversity. And there are plenty of examples in the literature that shows that. However, there are pretty much an equal number of studies which shows that in many other areas the relationship is random or even negative. And this basically means that if we protect areas of high carbon density through a carbon conservation scheme, for example, what may happen is that we display deforestation or habitat loss, we displace it somewhere else. So we move it away from a carbon dense area to a less carbon dense area. But this might be problematic for biodiversity if the relationship is negative. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to understand whether there are global patterns, general rules that apply in this relationship, and whether we can predict when the relationship is going to be stronger. So the first hypothesis we are testing is that one of the key factors in this relationship is actually the scale, and particularly the spatial extent. So the hypothesis here is that, emerging from the literature, is that if you look at the relationship between carbon density and biodiversity, and in this case, I'm specifically focusing on species richness, so alpha diversity. So if you look at the relationship from a global perspective, you are likely to find a win-win situation, so a positive relationship. This basically means that on a global scale, carbon-rich areas tend to be in the tropics, and biodiversity-rich areas tend to be in the tropics as well. But then as you narrow down your scale and you move from a global extent to a more local extent, you are less likely to find a positive relationship in general. And if you go to the scale of an ecoregion, you can have a mixed condition in which some ecoregion will have a positive relationship and others will have a random or negative relationship. The second hypothesis is that at the extent of an ecoregion, which is where conservation action takes place, you are probably able to predict the correlation between species richness and carbon density if each of these two key ecosystem properties is in itself predictable, so well related to environmental variables such as climate, soil profile, and primary productivity. So in other words, if we can successfully predict the distribution of species and the distribution of carbon from environmental properties, then it is more likely that these two variables will be actually well correlated. So we tested this hypothesis by using global distribution data on vertebrate species and above ground vegetation mass, so above ground carbon. So we basically calculated the correlation between species richness and carbon density at a global scale, then we repeated it for each biogeographic realm, then we repeated it for each biome within the realm and for each ecoregion of the world. And as you can see, as you move from a global extent to a more local extent, the strength of the relationship gets down on average, meaning that, as we were hypothesizing, the relationship is strong globally, but it gets on average weaker as you move at the level of an ecoregion. And actually, across ecoregion, we found a huge variety. So ecoregion with a strong positive correlation and ecoregion with a strong negative correlation between biodiversity and carbon. So we explored this further and we tried to understand whether the ability of environmental variables to predict carbon and to predict biodiversity were the main driver of the relationship between these two properties. And we actually found that it was the case. So ecoregions where carbon could be predicted and biodiversity could be predicted by climatic and soil variables were actually more likely to show a strong correlation between these two properties, so biodiversity and carbon. And we also tested this in combination with with many other potential factors, including, for example, human impact. So once again, what we found is that if you can predict biodiversity from climate and soil data, and if you can also predict carbon from climate and soil data, that particular ecoregion is going to be likely to have a strong correlation between the two. If you cannot predict one of these two variables, then you're probably in an ecoregion with weak or negative correlation between biodiversity and carbon. So, 3 take-home messages. First of all, scale matters, as usual in macroecology, in this relationship. So global extent is more likely to have higher correlation, and local extent is less likely. And then again, at a local extent, you can predict the strength of the correlation if you look at environmental variable, climate and soil. And we also found something that I didn't show here, so that there is a relationship with human impact. So ecoregion with stronger human impact can actually show a few remaining natural areas with both biodiversity and carbon richness over time. Thank you very much.
All right, and next up we have Fanny Langerwitz from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research. Climate Impact Research. And yours is perfect. There we go. Awesome. And then that's the button. Button for the laser, and then it's just.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everybody. I will introduce you to some study we did about the adaptation of vegetation to future climate change in a highland area in Southeast Asia. So we have climate change, and this will more or less increase the temperatures and will change the precipitation pattern. And in Southeast Asia, the temperature is expected to rise about 2 K, and the precipitation is expected to change by minus 20% to plus 20%. And the question is now, how do plant communities change due to this climate change pressure? And other shifts in the vegetation towards higher elevation. And for this, we had example study areas in the highlands area of northern Vietnam. It is Sapa, it has tropical climate. The precipitation change is about up to 5%, and the temperature increase up to 4 K. And we have large differences in elevation. So we have a valley at about 500 meters above sea level, and the mountains are about 2,800 meters. To understand how the vegetation might change due to climate change, we applied a dynamic global vegetation model. It kind of splits the world into cells, and for each cell calculates the vegetation depending on the climate. And we could identify, for instance, a reduction in tree biomass. And this, where is it? Anyway, on the left-hand side, you see the map from the beginning of the last century, and on the right-hand side, the map of the end of the current century. And in this area, you see a large decrease in tree biomass. So we have a reduction because the mortality is high for the trees. And we don't only have this reduction in the valleys, as it could be seen on the map, but we divided our whole area in pixels below 1,250 meter and above. And you see that you also have a reduction in the higher elevation, depicted in the red line, but the stronger reduction in lower elevation sites. This comes together with an increase in C4 grasses. And this is in the same area as we have this large reduction in trees. So the trees die and make space for grasses, and they can invade. But also in other areas in the map, we have a large increase in the C cover, in the cover of C4 grasses. And here, looking at the different elevation classes, you see that it's especially obvious for the high elevation classes. So we started with more or less 0, but also for the low elevation classes, there's a large increase in coverage with C4 grasses. But there's not only a change in the distribution of trees versus grasses, but we also could identify changes in the characteristics of the tree species. So for instance, this is one example showing the change in the specific leaf area of the trees, SLA. And we have an increase over time of the SLA in both elevation classes. And this shows that the trees got thinner leaves because they adapt to the changing climate. We also did this for the leaf longevity, showing that this is an inverse pattern, that the leaf longevity is going down over time. And we also saw changes in the wood density of the plants. So we have a shift in the distribution of different plant types, grasses and trees. And we have a tree mortality in the valleys higher, which enable the grasses to invade. And there are also changes in the plant characteristics, not only the distribution, but also in the which kind of species are growing in the new situation. Change. And this could be identified by looking at the specific leaf area, leaf longevity, and wood density. And thank you for your attention, and all my colleagues for your forward.
Thank you very much. That's awesome. All right, and next up we have Kathleen Seeley from the University of Miami. We're moving right along on time here. All right, here you go. So you click with the pointers and then this button.
Okay,
for the
the same
laser.
one. Okay. Thank you. I just want to talk about the impact of Hurricane Matthew on the Bahamas. Hurricane Matthew was a major storm that hit islands of Haiti, Cuba, and the Bahamian archipelago. This was a particularly severe hurricane that hit the Commonwealth of the Bahamas because of the impact on 4 major islands. Increasing severity of storms and precipitation events poses a very real change for small island developing states in meeting the 2030 agenda and achieving conservation goals. Flooding on low-lying islands has devastating effects, not only on property, but on natural resources, and particularly increasing the amount of pollution and waste that moves from land to sea. We work in the Bahamas with young marine explorers on specifically achieving some of the sustainable development goals as using citizen scientists and student scientists to collect information and indicators on achieving biodiversity goals, and particularly in the small island developing state, reduction of poverty, increase of opportunity and education. So we developed a community-based rapid ecological assessment to assess storm damage beyond property damage in a way that we could map and develop the environmental impacts of Hurricane Matthew on the coastal environment of the most populous island in the Bahamas, New Providence. 80% of the Bahamian population lives on this one island. We asked the question, what has happened to the coasts? And what we try to do is include the environmental costs of the hurricane in addition to the property costs. We look at water quality, nearshore fish, submerged aquatic vegetation, benthic invertebrates, solid waste, human disturbance to the coastline, protected area status, sediments, and pollutants. Our student scientists helped us a lot with the assessment in areas and neighborhoods in looking at vegetation damage, the degree of building damage, and the extent of flooding. The combined scientist teams of our professional scientists and student scientists sampled 14 areas, sites around New Providence, and looking at the various impacts along developed and undeveloped shorelines. Solid waste was a serious problem above and below the water. For small island developing states, in order to make progress in development of infrastructure and meet the Sustainable Development Goals, they need to invest in infrastructure. And all those investments can be undone with one severe storm. This is a map of the island of New Providence, and this shows you some of the spatial data sets that we looked at in order to quantify flooding damage. The hurricane hit from the southwest. As you can see the hurricane track in the lower map, and you can see the areas, the hotspots for flooding damage to private property and coastal environments. This shows vegetation damage, kind of different. More rocky shorelines, more elevated shorelines had more vegetation damage along the shorelines. This type of spatial information was combined with coastal surveys to come up with a priority setting exercise and highlight the areas along the shorelines that are most in need of coastal restoration and coastal protection. So this looks at our coastal ranking and looks at the community ranking. This shows the natural communities along the southwest coast of New Providence. There's Nassau, the major port. Imagine all the tourism and high-end revenue on this side of the island. This side of the island includes a national park, but also a lot of low-lying areas and neighborhoods where Bahamians live. So using this type of priority setting exercise, we can take the information, go back to the communities, and talk about the rebuild, relocate decisions that need to come out of after a major disaster. We use quick look reports to combine information on biodiversity, sediment pollutants, trash, and hurricane impacts in order to communicate information rapidly to the governments and NGOs. And funding for this is developing this as a unit of work for young marine explorers and stewards was funded by the Rapid Ocean Response Grant from the Waite Foundation. Thank you.
Alrighty. And for our final talk of the day, we have Natalia Norden from the Instituto Alexander von Humboldt. Come on up. All right. You have this in a...
okay. So just here.
Change the view, actually, because I think this is in a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
You want... Perfect. And then click through, and then that's your... That's your
wait, it's up.
Our first technical difficulty. We saved it for the last talk. It's convenient. Is it?
Pero no aparece.
Yeah.
Señor, pero no aparece.
They controlled over
okay.
there.
Sorry.
So here you go.
Thank you.
Perfect. There you go.
Okay. Hi, good morning to everyone. I'm working for the Humboldt Institute here in Colombia, and I'm going to be talking about species abundance, species frequency, and niche breadth in tropical dry forests here in Colombia. So it's been widely reported that the most common species are those that show the widest geographical range. And this has been shown for many different groups of organisms, so that we find usually a very strong and positive relationship between the logarithm of species abundance and the number of sites occupied. So if this is true, one could think that the process behind this mechanism is that the rare species have a narrow niche breadth, whereas the most common species have a wider niche breadth. So since this has been shown for several type of forests, including tropical rainforest and Andean forest, but one may wonder whether tropical dry forests follow this pattern because these ecosystems have high endemism, and we can see that there is a lot of species turnover between different types of tropical dry forests, so that there is no overlap between species composition in the different regions in tropical dry forests in South America. So to test this question, we have two specific questions. The first is, do common species tend to be the most frequent in tropical dry forests? And what is the relationship between tree species commonness and niche breadth? So to answer these questions, we established a network of seedling plots, of tree plots, sorry. We have 16 1-hectare plots throughout the country in all the regions with tropical dry forest. And for each of the plots, we have climatic variables related with precipitation and temperature, and edaphic variables related with soil properties. So to answer the first question, whether common species tend to be most frequent in tropical dry forest, we do see actually a positive relationship between the logarithm of total species abundance and frequency. We can see that the y-axis, the scale is log transformed, so that the most abundant species tend to occur in more plots. However, when we look at this same pattern, but we do not transform the y-axis, we can see that there are many very, very common species that tend to occur more locally, not in most of the plots, but only in 3 or 4 plots. So this is the test including all the species from all the plots, but if we look at this pattern for each of the plot, for each of the 1-hectare plot, so here each graph corresponds to a 1-hectare plot, we can see that the most abundant, locally abundant species in each plot tend to occur only in 1, 2, or 3 plots only. They are not really very frequent across tropical dry forests in Colombia. So to answer the second question, what is the relationship between tree species commonness and niche breadth? So we evaluated the niche breadth of each of the 607 species we had in all the 16 1-hectare plots, and we standardized this niche breadth by using a null model, so that because if you have many individuals, you have more chance to have a wider niche breadth. So we have to use a null model to correct for this bias. And we expected that rare species would have a narrower niche breadth than expected by chance, and common species would have a more a wider niche breadth than expected by chance. And that is what we found. Here we're seeing the correlation between the standardized effect size of niche breadth, that means including the null model, and the logarithm of f, which is the probability that 2 individuals are randomly taken from 2 plots belong to the same species. And actually we do find a negative relationship between these two. All the points that are between the 2 lines here, that means that these species are, the niche of these species is not different from what expected by chance, but the abundant species here tend to have a smaller smaller niche breadth than expected by chance. So to conclude, there is a positive relationship between the logarithm of total abundance and frequency, but if we look at this pattern at the local scale, the relationship can be the opposite. And contrary to expectations, many common species have a very narrow niche breadth, and this might be the result of dispersal limitation or biogeographical processes. Thank you.
All right. Let's give our speakers another round of applause for giving awesome presentations and staying on time, everybody. That's really great of you. So now we have, the session ends at 11:30, so we have about 12 minutes for questions. So if anybody has questions, please raise your hand. I'll point you out. And then you can direct your question to whichever of the speakers you'd like, and then we'll bring them up here to the mic so that everybody can hear them if that works. Okay? So, any questions for any of our speakers? Breathing right into the mic. Nobody? No questions? Yes, right there. Oh, we have a mic. That's awesome. real fancy.
Yeah, that's a question for Mattias Tschumi.
Coming up.
Okay. I just wanted to know how you do calculate your complexity gradient. Because what kind of variable do you use for that?
Basically, that was very simple, based on semi-natural grasslands. So in southern Sweden, these semi-natural grasslands, they have a high occurrence and also are important for agronomic schemes, but they strongly correlate to many other complexity variables like semi-natural habitats in general, and also like farm size and so on. So there is strong correlations between these. So that's why we just choose these as a proxy.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back. And then we'll get you right there.
Hello, this question is for Mattias. It was about the correlation between carbon and biodiversity.
Could you repeat the question, I think?
But no, the question is, this correlation might be due to the p-values. I wonder if it is like a bias in this case. It's for you. I wonder if finding a correlation between these two variables globally is due to the p-values, because when you work with p-values with big data, like in macroecology, there is a bias when you work with them, and then you pass to really narrow scales.
Yep, I think I understood the question. So all the correlation were done using Spearman ranked correlation. And when testing whether the correlation was actually influenced by the sample size, which we did by using area as a covariate, so ecoregional area, which is a proxy of sample size because we measure a correlation according to each pixel in the ecoregion, we found that was not a significant predictor. And we also found that the standard deviation of the two variables were not a significant predictor. So it's not that the correlation is higher if there is more standard deviation of the biodiversity or the carbon, and it's not higher if the area of the ecoregion, so the sample size, is higher. So we found a genuine relationship between the predictability of carbon and biodiversity from environmental variables and whether these two correlate with each other.
Okay, thanks.
And we had another question in the middle, and then another one up front.
My question was for Ben about deadwood. Yes. You mentioned during your talk that there's a perception that deadwood in some forestry that deadwood's a source of pest and disease, and I just wondered about the reality of that. So is the deadwood actually a source of pest and disease, or is it actually not? Is it a source of
In directly after these storm events, when we get massive amounts of fresh spruce wood, yes, it is. It is definitely an issue for bark beetle infestations. Later on, it could actually be the contrary, because that would also support a lot of predator beetles and insects that might actually be helpful for the pest species. But after larger storm events, yes, it is an issue.
Awesome. And then question up front here.
My question is about the deforestation to grasslands. Based on your study and the acknowledgement that these community types are changing, did you have any recommendations for the community or for the ecological community at large as to what to do next?
Not really. So we were looking at the natural vegetation and not at any managed forest or grasslands, and only this is like the potential change due to climate change. We see that there will be a loss of the forest in the valleys, and more grasses. So one could argue that there should be like deforestation, reforestation activities. So maybe with some species that can be managed better in this drier and hotter conditions. This could be like a management option, but we did not tackle this in our study. So one can think in this direction.
All right, any other questions? Yes, right back there.
This is for Kathleen with the Bahamas. I was wondering if the rankings that you did for restoration, you mentioned then the next step would be to actually undertake some sort of adaptation, and I wonder if the data that you used and how you ranked with them actually indicate what would be the most appropriate in terms of cost or social characteristics. You mentioned retreat or perhaps some sort of different adaptation. Does the work that you do give any sort of direction to that, or is that left entirely up to the local community to then interpret your data or the ranking?
No, we have 3 case studies of coastal restorations that have been done on the island, on the northern end, on public beaches. And so most of what we're looking at is what we would call soft engineering, restoring coastal buffer zones. So we do have, in working with the communities, we've looked at different scenarios of constructed wetlands to manage, flooding around that. So right now we're using that information to look at those red areas and develop a cost benefit, number of houses where flooding would be averted compared to the cost of restoring coastal areas. I didn't go into a lot of the sand mining and invasive species in the dunes, but we're looking at areas where you can do coastal restoration to avert flooding to specific areas and neighborhoods.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? Curious folks out there? If not, I'm going to steal the mic because I have a question. So Mike, I have a question for, I guess, Frederick and Moreno about the relationship between carbon storage and biodiversity. So I'm a marine guy, so I think of things like seagrass and mangroves and coral reefs, and I was curious if you thought if you might see that same kind of relationship, higher correlation, like the stronger correlation at the global scale that kind of may disappear at the local scale. And I know you guys may not be marine people, but even if not, I'd be curious to hear you guys take a stab at that, if you think that relationship would still apply in the ocean as opposed to on land. Yeah. Just mixing it up a little bit. Feel free to spitball. Hand wave.
So the correlation for seagrass, like carbon stored in seagrass?
Yeah. Or mangroves, or both, or?
Well, I guess mangroves can be compared to trees. And then I guess what Moreno said will hold for mangrove trees as well. Perhaps even at a local scale, carbon might be related to the tree diversity. For seagrass, I really have no idea.
That's okay.
How much carbon is stored in seagrass?
Lots.
Okay.
They store a lot, yeah. So mangroves and seagrass store lots of carbon biomass for very small areas, as I guess maybe to preface a little bit of background. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just adding, I think a good example would be the coral reef. So this is generally a place in which you have a lot of carbon stored, and we have also high diversity. And I mean, I don't know much about this, but I bet that if you look at different coral reefs, the relationship can be quite different, but probably broadly speaking, if there is a coral reef, it's more likely that you have a strong correlation. But then, if you look at coral reef in, I don't know, say Australia versus South America versus Africa, probably there is going to be differences. So I think, I mean, I didn't analyze that, but I suspect the relationship might hold.
Cool, awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. Appreciate that. All right, any other questions from our audience out there? All right, if not, then let's give our speakers again one more big round of applause for their excellent presentations and staying on time. You guys are the best. And we are finishing a minute early. So thank you again for all coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers. Thanks again, guys. You're the best. You made my job very easy.